In 2025, something remarkable happened that would make the British Empire turn in its grave. India, the country Britain systematically looted for 200 years, the nation they left impoverished and broken in 1947, just became the world's fourth largest economy, surpassing Japan and closing in on Germany. This isn't just an economic statistic. This is revenge. Sweet, calculated, 78-year-long revenge. When Britain left India in 1947, they left behind a country where 55% lived below the poverty line, 90% were rural, and per capita income was just 9% of Britain's. India's share of global GDP had collapsed from 23% to 3% under British rule. They stripped India's wealth, destroyed its industries, and left it for dead. But today, India's GDP stands at $4.19 trillion and growing at 6.2% annually, the fastest among major economies. Britain, growing at barely 1%, struggling with economic stagnation and watching their former colony leave them behind. This is the story of how India rose from the ashes of colonialism to become an economic superpower, without Britain's help, despite Britain's legacy, and as the ultimate proof that India had never needed Britain in the first place. Let's dive into the greatest comeback story in modern economic history. What Britain left behind, the devastation of 1947. To understand India's revenge, you first need to understand what Britain did to India. When the British East India Company arrived in India in the early 1700s, India was an economic powerhouse. India's share of global GDP was 23%, nearly a quarter of the entire world's economy. Indian textiles were prized across Europe. Indian craftsmen were world-renowned. Indian cities were centers of trade and culture. Then came 200 years of systematic economic extraction. India's share of global GDP collapsed from 23% in the early 18th century to just 3% when India gained independence in 1947. India's share of global industrial output declined from 25% in 1750 to 2% in 1900. The British didn't just rule India, they economically murdered it. In 1947, when India gained independence, 90% of India's population was rural and 55% lived below the international poverty line. Meet Rajesh Kumar, whose grandfather lived through the final years of British rule in Bengal. My grandfather told me stories of how British policies deliberately destroyed local industries. Rajesh told me from his home in Kolkata. Indian weavers who once exported textiles globally were forced to buy British cloth. When they couldn't compete, they starved. The British didn't just take our wealth, they destroyed our ability to create it. During British rule, 1757 to 1947, the average income in India decreased by 8% over 2 centuries. Meanwhile, UK's per capita income increased by almost 300% during the same period. Britain got rich while India got poor, and it wasn't an accident. It was policy. The British imposed crushing land taxes that impoverished farmers. They destroyed India's textile industry to protect British manufacturers. They extracted raw materials and forced India to buy expensive British finished goods. When 300 years of British rule ended in 1947, economist Angus Deaton observed that the deprivation in childhood of Indians was as severe as that of any large group in history. A child born in India in the closing years of British rule could expect to live just 27 years. This was India's starting point in 1947, impoverished, illiterate, with destroyed industries and a devastated population. The British left believing India would never recover. They were spectacularly wrong. The first 30 years, building from nothing. India's revenge didn't happen overnight. The first 30 years after independence were about survival and building foundations. Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru chose a path of self-reliance and industrialization, not because it was fashionable, but because India had no choice. The West wasn't interested in helping a formerly colonized nation succeed. People criticize Nehru's socialist policies now, explained Dr. Priya Sharma, an economic historian at Delhi University. But in 1947, India had no industrial base, no capital, and faced hostile global powers. Nehru focused on building heavy industries, investing in education, and creating self-sufficiency. It was slow, but it was necessary. For the first time in the 20th century, the Indian economy began to grow as India invested in capital goods industries and agricultural infrastructure. Industrial growth and the Green Revolution in agriculture moved the economy from stagnation to growth. Meet Vikram Patel, whose father was part of India's early industrial workforce. "My father worked in a government steel plant built in the 1950s, Vikram said. The wages were modest, but he had dignity. He wasn't working for British masters anymore. He was building India. That psychological shift was as important as the economic one. After 50 years of independence, life expectancy at birth had risen from 27 years to 63 years. India was healing, slowly but steadily, from 2 centuries of economic violence. The 1991 revolution, India unleashed. The real revenge began in 1991. India's economy was in crisis. Foreign exchange reserves had dropped to just 2 weeks of imports. The government was forced to liberalize the economy, opening India to global trade and investment. Critics said India would be dominated by Western corporations. Instead, India exploded. 1991 was India's declaration of economic independence, explained Anita Desai, who started her IT company in 1995. "We weren't begging for British help anymore. We were competing globally and winning." The IT revolution hit India like lightning. Indian engineers, many educated in institutes built during the Nehru era, suddenly had global opportunities. Companies like Infosys, Wipro, and TCS became global giants. Indian software powered Silicon Valley, Wall Street, and London's financial district. Yes, London, the former colonial master, now dependent on Indian expertise. "The irony is delicious," Anita laughed. British banks outsource their software to India. British companies hire Indian engineers. The country that once forced us to buy their textiles now depends on our technology. That's poetic justice. The Modi era, Atmanirbhar Bharat, self-reliant India. Prime Minister Modi's Atmanirbhar Bharat, self-reliant India, initiative focuses on reducing dependence on foreign countries, especially in technology, defense, semiconductors, and critical minerals. The message to Britain and the West is clear. India doesn't need you. India will build its own technology, manufacture its own goods, and chart its own course. Make in India, 2014, transformed India into a manufacturing powerhouse. India emerged as the world's 3rd largest startup ecosystem. Meet Arjun Mehta, CEO of an electric vehicle startup in Bangalore. 10 years ago, we'd have to source everything from China or the West, Arjun explained. Today, we design in India, manufacture in India, and export globally. Modi's policies incentivize domestic manufacturing. We're not copying Western models. We're creating Indian solutions for Indian problems that happen to work globally. India benefited from the China Plus One strategy, with companies like Apple, Samsung, and Foxconn expanding manufacturing in India. Western companies that once viewed India only as a market now see it as a manufacturing hub, tech innovation center, and economic powerhouse they can't ignore. The moment of victory, surpassing Japan in 2025. And then came 2025. India's nominal GDP reached $4.187 trillion, surpassing Japan's $4.186 trillion, making India the 4th largest economy in the world. India is the fastest growing major economy, with the IMF projecting 6.2% growth in 2025 and 6.3% in 2026. In contrast, Japan's economy is expected to grow by just 0.6% in 2025. Even more satisfying? The IMF forecasts that by 2028, India's GDP will reach $5.58 trillion, overtaking Germany to become the world's 3rd largest economy. Germany, Europe's economic powerhouse, will be surpassed by the country Britain left impoverished. When I heard India became 4th largest economy, I cried, admitted Meera Reddy, a 72-year-old retired teacher in Chennai. I remember my parents' generation living in poverty under British rule. I remember the hunger, the humiliation, the constant message that Indians were inferior. Today, my grandchildren are engineers working for global companies. India has proven that we were never inferior. We were just colonized. The numbers don't lie. India's stunning growth. India's GDP doubled from $2 trillion in 2014 to over $4 trillion in 2025. Per capita income rose from $1,438 in 2014 to $2,880 in 2025. Between 2006 and 2016, 271 million people were lifted out of poverty. That's more than the entire population of Britain lifted out of poverty in a single decade. Meanwhile, Britain's economy grows at barely 1% annually, faces post-Brexit challenges, and struggles with declining global influence. The former master is stagnating while the former colony soars. Britain's per capita income is still higher than India's, Dr. Sharma noted. But the trajectories are clear. India is rising fast. Britain is stagnant. In a generation, the economic relationship will completely invert. What makes India's revenge so sweet? India's success is satisfying not just because of the numbers, but because of how it happened. India didn't succeed by copying Britain or begging for Western help. India succeeded by being distinctly Indian, leveraging its diversity, its democratic institutions, its technological prowess, and its sheer determination to prove the colonizers wrong. Britain said Indians couldn't govern themselves, explained Vikram Patel. We created the world's largest democracy. They said we couldn't compete economically. We're now surpassing developed nations. They said we were backward. We put satellites in space and landed on the moon. Every Indian success is a refutation of colonial lies. The psychological victory might be even more important than the economic one. For 200 years, British colonialism conditioned Indians to believe they were inferior. Today's India rejects that narrative completely. Meet Priya Singh, a 28-year-old software engineer in Hyderabad. My generation doesn't feel inferior to anyone, Priya said confidently. We work with colleagues in America, Europe, everywhere. We're equals. Actually, often we're better. Indian engineers are sought after globally. That confidence comes from India's economic success. The British legacy that still haunts. India's revenge is incomplete because British colonialism's damage runs deep. Regions under direct British control during colonialism still show lower private investment and economic opportunity today compared to regions with indirect rule. The loss of human capital and destroyed industries still haunts certain areas 78 years after independence. Britain has never apologized for what they did to India, noted Dr. Sharma. They've never paid reparations. They still celebrate their empire in museums while ignoring the millions who died under British rule. India's economic success is our own achievement despite them, not because of them. But here's the ultimate revenge. India no longer needs Britain's apology. India's success is the answer to centuries of exploitation. Every percentage point of GDP growth is a refutation. Every Indian company succeeding globally is proof. Every child educated is a reversal of British attempts to keep Indians illiterate. What comes next? India's future. India's revenge story is still being written. By 2028, India will be the third largest economy. By 2030, projections suggest India could have the world's largest workforce, 600 million people, driving innovation and growth. By mid-century, some economists predict India could challenge China for the second largest economy position. India's growth isn't finished, Arjun Mehta said confidently. We're still a developing country with enormous, untapped potential. If we maintain 6 to 7% growth for another 2 decades, India could be a $10 trillion economy. That's when the West will truly understand what they underestimated. But for many Indians, the victory has already been achieved. India has proven that colonization was unnecessary, that independence was the right choice, and that India's poverty was caused by British policies, not Indian capabilities. We want to hear from you. If you're Indian, how does this economic rise make you feel? Does it feel like revenge, validation, or something else? If you're British, how do you view your country's colonial history in light of India's success? And for everyone else, what does India's rise mean for the future of global power dynamics? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this video gave you perspective on one of history's greatest economic comeback stories, smash that like button and subscribe. Watch next, how India became a tech superpower while Britain declined. The story of how India's IT revolution humbled the former colonial master.